If Ethan Cole is on this airplane, then we're in better hands than you think. Captain Robert Hayes said it quietly, but not quietly enough. Claire Whitmore looked up from her phone before the captain had even finished shaking the stranger's hand. 5 minutes earlier, Ethan had been nothing more than the man in seat 27B, a tired-looking father in a faded navy jacket with a child's backpack tucked beneath his shoes. His 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, sat by the window holding a paper airplane covered in tiny blue stars. Claire had noticed them only because a last-minute aircraft change had erased her business class upgrade and placed the CEO of Whitmore Aerospace Holdings and Economy for the first time in years. She had spent the first 10 minutes answering emails, irritated by the narrow seat, the crowded aisle, and the fact that Sophie's cardboard model airplane kept brushing her sleeve. Ethan had noticed. "Soph, keep the wings on your side." "Sorry," Sophie whispered. Claire gave a distracted nod without looking away from her screen. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Hayes stepped into the cabin while a flight attendant spoke to him near the forward galley. His eyes moved casually over the rows until they reached 27B. He stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. "Ethan Cole." Ethan's expression changed by almost nothing. That was what Claire noticed first. He didn't brighten at being recognized. He didn't seem impressed that the captain knew him. If anything, he looked like a man who had just heard a door open that he had spent years keeping closed. Hayes walked down the aisle. "I didn't know you were on my flight." Ethan stood just enough to shake his hand. "Good to see you, Captain." Hayes laughed softly. "Robert, after what we went through, I think you've earned a right to call me Robert." Sophie looked up at her father. Claire's phone lowered an inch. Ethan glanced toward the other passengers. It was a long time ago. The message was clear. Hayes understood it. His smile faded into something quieter, almost grateful. Some things don't become less important because they happened a long time ago. Then he leaned closer and said the sentence Claire knew she wasn't meant to hear. "I still owe you my life." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't owe me anything." For 3 seconds, neither man spoke. Then Hayes nodded, touched Ethan once on the shoulder, and returned toward the cockpit. Claire watched him go before turning toward the man beside her. Ethan was already fastening his seat belt as if nothing unusual had happened. Sophie wasn't willing to pretend. "Dad," she whispered, "was Captain Hayes one of the pilots you saved?" Ethan went still. "Sophie, one word. Gentle but final." The girl lowered her eyes to her paper airplane. Claire closed the email on her phone. She studied Ethan properly for the first time. The worn jacket, the inexpensive watch, the small scar near his thumb, the calm hands resting over a backpack decorated with planets. None of it fit the way a veteran airline captain had just looked at him. Then the name finally caught somewhere in Claire's memory. Ethan Cole. She had seen it before. Not on a passenger manifest. Not in a company directory. Somewhere much more important. She opened her laptop, but before she could search, Ethan turned toward her. His voice remained polite. "Ms. Whitmore, whatever you think you heard, I'd appreciate it if you left it alone." Claire froze. She had never introduced herself. Claire kept her eyes on Ethan for another second. "I never told you my name." Ethan reached beneath the seat and adjusted Sophie's backpack. "Your picture was in the business section this morning." It was a reasonable answer, which somehow made Claire trust it less. Before she could respond, the flight attendant asked everyone to prepare for departure. Ethan turned toward Sophie and checked her seatbelt, then gently moved the paper airplane into the seat pocket. "Window shade up, kiddo." Sophie smiled. "You always say that. Because you always forget." The ordinary tenderness between them made the exchange with Captain Hayes feel even stranger. Ethan did not look like a man hiding importance. He looked like a father making sure his daughter was comfortable. That morning had begun before sunrise in their small rented townhouse outside Seattle. Ethan had packed 2 turkey sandwiches, sliced an apple for Sophie, and spent 10 minutes trying to fix a crooked ponytail before finally admitting defeat. Sophie had laughed at him through the bathroom mirror. Mom did it better. Ethan had smiled, though the words still found the same quiet place inside him after 4 years. Your mom did almost everything better. On the kitchen table sat Sophie's science fair project, a cardboard airplane with blue stars painted across its wings. She had built it herself, except for one stubborn section of the tail Ethan had helped reinforce. Their trip to Boston was for the National Youth Science Showcase, and Ethan had used nearly all his saved travel points to buy the tickets. Sophie believed he was more excited than she was. She was right. Across town, Claire's morning had begun on the 34th floor of Whitmore Aerospace Holdings, with 3 assistants, 2 attorneys, and a conference call concerning a proposed acquisition worth $480 million. She had approved the final review at 6:45 that morning and left for the airport believing the transaction would define her year. Now, 30,000 feet seemed farther away than usual as the aircraft climbed over Washington. Sophie pressed her face toward the window. "Dad, look." Ethan did not need to look. "Mount Rainier." "How did you know?" "Because it has been there a while." Sophie rolled her eyes. Claire almost smiled. Almost. A few minutes later, Sophie unfolded her paper airplane and showed Claire the tiny diagrams drawn beneath one wing. "Those are airflow arrows," she explained. "Dad taught me." Claire glanced at Ethan. "You teach aerodynamics, too?" 8-year-olds. Only the ones who refuse to stop asking questions. "He knows everything about airplanes," Sophie said proudly. Ethan's expression tightened. "Not everything." Claire leaned back. "Captain Hayes seemed to think you knew enough." Ethan looked toward the window. "Robert remembers an old job differently than I do." "Were you a pilot?" Claire asked. For the first time, Ethan took several seconds before answering. "Not anymore." Claire studied him. That answer did not match the question exactly. Before she could press further, a faint vibration traveled through the floor beneath their feet. Most passengers did not react. Ethan did. His eyes lifted toward the ceiling. The vibration stopped. Sophie continued coloring. 10 seconds later, it came again, slightly longer this time. Ethan slowly turned his head toward the wing. Claire watched the warmth disappear from his face. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan did not answer. He checked his watch and began counting under his breath. Then the vibration came a third time. Ethan reached for the flight attendant button. The flight attendant arrived with the practiced smile of someone expecting a request for water. Ethan leaned slightly into the aisle. "Could you pass a note to Captain Hayes?" Her expression changed when she recognized him. "Of course, Mr. Cole." Ethan took a napkin from the tray table and wrote a single sentence across it. Claire tried not to read it. She caught only 3 words before he folded it. "Left side, interval, vibration." The attendant carried it forward. "Dad," Sophie asked. Ethan turned back to her, and the tension in his face softened immediately. "Everything is fine, sweetheart. You always say that when you are thinking hard." Claire noticed his hand resting calmly on Sophie's arm. No panic, no performance. He listened. 20 seconds passed, then 40. The vibration returned beneath their feet, faint enough that a man across the aisle continued sleeping. Ethan checked his watch. 47 seconds, he murmured. "What happens every 47 seconds?" Claire asked. "I do not know yet, but you have an idea." Ethan looked toward the wing. An idea is not the same thing as an answer. Claire knew that kind of discipline. Her engineers were trained to separate evidence from assumption, although executives rarely had the patience. "What did you hear?" she asked. "Not hear. Feel." Ethan placed 2 fingers against the armrest. There is a repeating vibration under load. It disappears when the aircraft levels and returns during certain adjustments. Claire stared at him. "That sounds very specific for someone who said aviation was an old job." Ethan did not respond. The seat belt sign illuminated. A moment later, the aircraft began a gradual turn. Claire looked at the moving map. They had been tracking southeast. Now the route was changing. The cabin announcement followed. Captain Hayes said they were making a precautionary diversion to Boise for a technical inspection. His voice was calm. Most passengers barely reacted. Claire did. She turned toward Ethan. "Your note changed the flight." The captain changed the flight. After reading your note. That is his responsibility. Sophie watched them with open curiosity. "Dad used to do that." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Sophie, do what?" Claire asked. Sophie lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "Listen to airplanes." Ethan looked at his daughter, not angry, just tired. "Your coloring book is under your seat." Sophie understood and reached for it. Claire waited until the girl was busy. You recognized something before the crew announced anything. The crew has instruments I cannot see. They know more than I do. You keep answering questions I did not ask. That finally made Ethan look at her. Claire was used to people becoming nervous when she held their gaze. Ethan did not. And you keep asking questions that are none of your business. The words were quiet enough that Sophie did not hear them. Claire should have been offended. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar. Respect. Ethan turned back toward the window. The aircraft descended through a thin layer of clouds. A minute later, the flight attendant returned. She stopped beside Ethan and spoke softly. Captain Hayes says you were right about the pattern. He also said to tell you he remembers Anchorage. Ethan's face went completely still. Claire saw it happen. Not fear, memory. Something older. Something he had spent years learning how to carry. Thank you, he said. The attendant walked away. Claire opened her laptop. She had no intention of searching his name while Sophie could see the screen. But one question had become impossible to ignore. What happened in Anchorage? Ethan watched the clouds for several seconds. Something I promised my daughter I would leave in the past. Then Sophie looked up from her coloring book. Is that where Mom met Captain Hayes? Ethan turned toward her sharply. Claire said nothing. Sophie's pencil stopped moving. Ethan lowered his voice. Yes, sweetheart. The aircraft continued its descent toward Boise. Claire closed her laptop without searching. For the first time since meeting Ethan Cole, she understood that the mystery beside her was not hiding a resume. He was protecting a wound. The wheels touched down in Boise with a soft bounce, and only then did Ethan let his shoulders relax. Sophie pressed both palms against the window. Are we staying here? Only until they check the airplane, Ethan said. Around them, phones appeared almost immediately. Meetings were being rearranged. Connections were being missed. Claire was already typing a message to her chief operating officer when her screen filled with an incoming call from Daniel Mercer, the executive leading Whitmore Aerospace Holdings acquisition team. She answered quietly. Tell Boston we may be delayed. Daniel sounded irritated. We cannot delay tomorrow morning. The North Star Aviation deal closes at 9. Their board is already nervous. Ethan's eyes moved toward Claire at the words North Star Aviation. It lasted less than a second, but she saw it. I will be there, Claire said, and make sure the technical review is final. Into the call. Ethan was looking straight ahead now. North Star, he asked. Claire studied him. You know the company? I know the name. That is becoming a pattern with you. Ethan unfastened Sophie's seatbelt after the sign went dark. So, is asking strangers for information they do not owe you. Claire felt the sting because he was right, but years of running a company had trained her to push when other people pulled away. My company is about to spend $480 million on an aviation technology business. A man sitting beside me recognizes a mechanical pattern before anyone announces a problem, sends a note to the cockpit, and causes an experienced captain to divert the aircraft. Then that same man reacts when I mention the company I am buying. You can understand why I'm asking questions. Ethan stood and pulled Sophie's backpack from beneath the seat. You are assuming the note caused the diversion. Did it not? Captain Hayes made a safety decision. That is his job. And what exactly was yours? Claire asked. Ethan looked at her. Today, getting my daughter to Boston. Claire exhaled. You know what I mean? Sophie slipped between them, hugging her model airplane against her chest. My dad fixes things people with expensive suits cannot. Silence settled over all three of them. Ethan looked down. Sophie, what? You do. Claire glanced at her tailored charcoal suit, then at Ethan. I suppose I walked into that one. Sophie smiled. Ethan almost did, but the expression disappeared when Claire said, Were you a mechanic? The question was not cruel, but something in her tone carried the old hierarchy she used without noticing. Ethan heard it. Would that make what I said less useful? Claire paused. That is not what I meant. Maybe not. He lifted Sophie's backpack onto one shoulder. But you wanted a title before you decided how seriously to take me. Claire had no immediate answer. That bothered her more than his criticism. Passengers began filing into the terminal while maintenance crews gathered outside. Through the window, Ethan studied the aircraft for several seconds, his attention fixed on the left side. Then he turned away. Claire followed with Sophie between them. At the gate, An airline representative announced that inspections could take several hours. Sophie groaned softly. Ethan crouched beside her. Science fair is tomorrow afternoon. We have time. Promise? Promise. Claire watched Sophie hand him the paper airplane as though his promise had settled the matter completely. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel had sent the final North Star technical package. Claire opened it while walking, more to escape the uncomfortable conversation than from necessity. The first page displayed a photograph of North Star's flagship stabilization system. Ethan passed behind her, saw the image, and stopped. This time there was no subtle reaction. Where did you get that? Claire turned. It is part of the company I am acquiring. Ethan stared at the diagram. Do not sign anything tomorrow. Claire's executive. Instincts returned immediately. You cannot make a statement like that without explaining it. Ethan's face hardened. I just did. Mr. Cole, I run an aerospace company. I cannot cancel a $480 million transaction because a former mechanic recognizes a picture. Sophie went quiet. Ethan did too. Then he stepped closer, not threatening, simply certain. Your title works in your company, Miss Whitmore. Not in this terminal, and not with me. Claire held his gaze. Ethan pointed once toward the image on her screen. But if North Star told you they designed that system, someone lied to you. Claire stared at Ethan, waiting for the explanation he had refused to give. Around them, passengers moved toward restaurants and charging stations, already turning the diversion into an inconvenience they would complain about later. Ethan seemed to have forgotten all of them. His attention remained fixed on the stabilization system displayed on Claire's screen. What exactly is wrong with it? She asked. Ethan glanced at Sophie. Not here. You just told me someone lied to my company. And I meant it. Then give me something I can verify. Ethan's expression tightened. Ask North Star who wrote the original load compensation sequence. Claire waited. That is all. For now. Sophie tugged gently at his sleeve. Dad, I am hungry. The hardness left his face instantly. Then food outranks aerospace. He took her hand and walked toward a cafe near the concourse. Claire remained where she was, irritated by how easily he could end a conversation she controlled everywhere else. She opened the technical package again and searched for the phrase Ethan had used. Load compensation sequence. 37 results appeared. Most were buried in engineering appendices. One referenced an older architecture developed under a federal flight safety program in Anchorage 9 years earlier. Claire stopped scrolling. Anchorage. She looked toward the cafe. Ethan was cutting a turkey sandwich in half for Sophie. He looked nothing like the man her search results were beginning to describe. Claire typed his full name. The first pages were useless. Then an archived trade publication appeared. The photograph loaded slowly. Ethan was younger, wearing a flight suit beside a prototype aircraft. Captain Robert Hayes stood 3 people away. Claire enlarged the caption. Ethan Cole, Senior Flight Safety Engineer. She read it twice. Another result referenced a test program suspended after an in-flight systems failure. Public details were limited. Several records had been sealed after a federal review. One sentence remained visible in an archived summary. Corrective guidance developed by Cole was credited with allowing the flight crew to stabilize the aircraft and return safely. Claire looked up again. Ethan was wiping mustard from Sophie's thumb with a napkin. There was no arrogance in him. No trace of someone waiting to be discovered. That unsettled her more than the resume itself. She walked to the cafe and stopped beside their table. Ethan saw her phone and immediately knew. You searched. You gave me a reason. I gave you a technical question. You gave me half an answer and expected me to risk $480 million on trust. Sophie looked between them. Ethan lowered his voice. Not in front of her. Claire understood too late. I found Anchorage. Ethan's eyes changed. Sophie stopped chewing. What did you find? He asked. A test flight. Captain Hayes. Your name. A systems failure. Ethan stood slowly. That is enough. Claire softened her voice. The report says your guidance helped bring the aircraft back safely. Reports say many things. Was Rachel involved? The question escaped before Claire could reconsider it. Ethan became completely still. Sophie looked down at her sandwich. Claire knew immediately that she had crossed the line. I am sorry. Ethan gathered Sophie's things. You should be. Ethan, I was trying to understand. No, you were trying to complete a file. He placed Sophie's paper airplane carefully into her backpack. There's a difference. Claire did not defend herself. Ethan took Sophie's hand, but before he could leave, an announcement asked Ethan Cole to report to the service desk. Captain Hayes was waiting there. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, then walked over. Claire stayed behind. She could not hear the first exchange, but Hayes eventually glanced toward her. Then Ethan said something that made the captain's expression turn serious. Hayes looked back at Claire once more. When Ethan returned, Claire did not ask what they had discussed. Ethan stopped beside her anyway. You wanted to know why Robert remembers my name? His voice was quiet. Ask him what happened after we landed in Anchorage. Claire looked toward the captain. Ethan continued before she could speak. And if you're buying North Star, ask who spent 9 years making sure you never heard the answer. Claire waited until Ethan and Sophie had moved toward the windows before approaching Captain Hayes. The captain studied her for a moment. He told you to ask me? He did. Hayes looked past her toward Ethan, who was kneeling beside Sophie as she repaired one bent wing on her paper airplane. Then he must think you need to hear it. Claire lowered her voice. What happened after Anchorage? Hayes folded his arms. 9 years ago, Ethan was the senior flight safety engineer on a prototype program. Brilliant man. Annoyingly careful. He found a repeating instability in the load compensation software during simulation testing. Claire felt her stomach tighten. The same system North Star sells? Not the same name. Same foundation. Hayes continued. Ethan recommended suspending flight tests until the software could be rewritten. Management refused. Too much money. Too many deadlines. During a test flight, the exact instability Ethan predicted appeared. His instructions from the ground helped us identify the pattern and stabilize the aircraft. And afterward, that is the part people buried. Hayes glanced toward Sophie. Ethan refused to sign a report blaming the crew. Rachel backed him. Claire remembered Sophie's question. His wife worked on the program? Systems documentation and compliance. She found internal records, showing that warnings had been edited before reaching federal reviewers. Ethan and Rachel turned over what they had. The program collapsed. Contracts disappeared. Lawyers arrived. People who had called Ethan indispensable suddenly stopped returning his calls. Claire looked down at her phone, where North Star's acquisition package was still open. North Star bought the technology. Pieces of it changed hands several times. Companies changed names. Executives retired. Paper trails became very convenient. What happened to Rachel? Hayes paused. Not what you were thinking. There was no conspiracy. Years later, she became ill. Ethan had already spent too many years choosing work over home because he believed fixing the system was his responsibility. When Rachel needed him, he chose her. After she died, he chose Sophie. He walked away from aviation almost completely. Claire looked across the terminal. Ethan had taken Sophie's damaged paper airplane and was carefully straightening the tail with his thumbnail. The image landed harder than any corporate biography could have. He could have gone back, Claire said. Everyone wanted him back, Hayes replied. He did not care. Sophie had already lost her mother. He decided she was not losing her father to another 100-hour workweek. Claire said nothing. Her phone vibrated. Daniel Mercer again. She answered. Claire, North Star accepted every final condition. We sign at 9 tomorrow. No more delays. Claire looked at Hayes. Daniel, send me the complete technical provenance for the stabilization platform. Silence. We already reviewed it. Send it again. Why? Because I asked. She ended the call. 5 minutes later, the files arrived. Claire searched the oldest appendices first. The current system was called North Star Adaptive Stability Control. 8 years earlier, it had carried another name. Before that, another. She followed the ownership transfers backward until she reached a scanned federal filing. At the bottom was a reference to the original load compensation architecture. Primary technical contributor, Ethan Michael Cole. Claire stopped breathing for a second. His name had been removed from every modern presentation she had seen. Another document appeared beneath it, an internal warning regarding unresolved oscillation under specific load conditions. The language was almost identical to what Ethan had described on the airplane. Claire walked toward him. Ethan looked up before she reached them. You found it. North Star is selling my company a system built on work you helped develop. Partly. And the warning from Anchorage was never fully resolved. Ethan's silence answered first. Sophie looked between them. Claire lowered her voice. Why did you not expose this years ago? I did. Ethan handed the repaired airplane back to Sophie. People heard what was profitable to hear. Claire looked at the acquisition documents on her screen. $480 million. Months of negotiations. Her board waiting in Boston. Ethan stood. Now you have a choice they did not make. Claire met his eyes. What choice? Ethan nodded toward the contract. Whether the people inside the aircraft matter more than the people around your boardroom table. Claire did not answer immediately. Most of her adult life, $480 million had been the kind of number that forced every other consideration out of a room. Ethan had reduced it to one question. People or pressure? Her phone rang again. She declined to call. I need evidence North Star cannot explain away. Ethan looked towards Sophie. And I need to get my daughter to Boston. Before Claire could respond, the gate agent announced that the aircraft had been cleared after inspection and boarding would resume within 20 minutes. A maintenance supervisor approached Captain Hayes near the service desk. They spoke briefly, then both looked toward Ethan. The supervisor crossed the terminal. Mr. Cole? Ethan stood. Yes. Captain Hayes said you identified the interval before the cockpit received the maintenance indication. Ethan glanced at Sophie before answering. I noticed a repeating vibration. 47 seconds? Approximately. The supervisor gave a slow nod. That helped us narrow the inspection. Thank you. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it once. Then another man approached from the airline operations office, gray-haired, wearing an identification badge on a blue lanyard. He stopped when he saw Ethan. Ethan Cole. I thought Robert was joking. Ethan gave a tired smile. Hello, Frank. Claire watched the greeting. No surprise from Ethan. Only recognition. Frank introduced himself to Sophie, asked about her science project, then turned back to Ethan. We still teach your stabilization response in recurrent training. Ethan lowered his voice. You teach the crew who refined it. You wrote the first protocol, and Robert proved it worked. Frank smiled, still refusing credit after 9 years. Claire felt something shift inside her. She had spent the morning trying to determine Ethan's status by asking what title he had held. Now men with decades in aviation were answering the question without being asked. They did not treat him like a celebrity. They treated him like someone whose judgment had once mattered when judgment mattered most. Sophie tugged Claire's sleeve. They always do this. Do what? Claire asked. No, Dad. Ethan heard her. Sophie. She grinned. It is true. Boarding began. Ethan thanked the men and collected their bags. Claire walked beside him toward the jet bridge. I owe you an apology. For which part? There was the faintest humor in his voice. The mechanic comment. Ethan looked ahead. There is nothing wrong with being a mechanic. I know. Do you? Claire accepted that one without defending herself. I should have asked what you knew instead of deciding what your job made your knowledge worth. Ethan finally looked at her. That is closer. They boarded. Sophie reclaimed the window seat. Claire sat in the middle, and Ethan returned to 27B. Before Claire fastened her belt, she opened the acquisition calendar and stared at the 9 o'clock meeting scheduled for the next morning. Come with me, she said. Ethan looked over. Where? Boston. My boardroom. Show them what you showed me. No, Claire blinked. People negotiated with her. They delayed. They asked for money. They rarely said no without decoration. I can compensate you. Ethan's expression cooled. That is exactly the wrong answer. Claire closed her laptop. Then tell me the right one. Do your own investigation. Decide whether you believe the evidence when there is nobody beside you to make the decision easier. And if I find what you say, I will. Ethan looked towards Sophie, who was carefully tracing blue stars onto her paper wing. Then cancel the meeting. Claire held his gaze. And after that, the cabin door closed. Ethan fastened his seatbelt. After that, I will show you why. By the time the flight reached Boston, Claire had stopped thinking like a buyer and started thinking like an investigator. She did not call Ethan again that night. That mattered. Instead, from her hotel suite, She opened every technical appendix Northstar had provided and compared them against the archived federal records from Anchorage. At 12:17 in the morning, she found the first discrepancy. Northstar described the load compensation architecture as independently developed 8 years earlier. The Federal Archive showed an earlier version carrying Ethan Cole's technical attribution. At 1:43, Claire found something worse. A risk disclosure mentioned oscillation under unusual load conditions, but the supporting test data ended 6 months before the problem had supposedly been resolved. The missing months covered the Anchorage program. At 3:12, Claire called Daniel Mercer. "I want the acquisition suspended." Silence followed. "Claire, the board meets in less than 6 hours. Then they can hear it from me. Northstar will walk. Let them." Daniel lowered his voice. $480 million is not something you stop because a stranger on an airplane told you a story. Claire looked at the old federal filing on her screen. "That stranger asked me to verify it myself. I did." At 9 o'clock, 12 directors sat around the Whitmore Aerospace conference table, expecting signatures. Claire placed the signed agreement in front of her. For 40 minutes, she walked them through the missing records, altered technical history, and unresolved questions surrounding Northstar's system. Several directors argued that the financial exposure of stopping was enormous. Claire agreed. Then she closed the presentation. "Our exposure is irrelevant if we knowingly buy technology whose safety history we cannot verify." The room became quiet. The acquisition was suspended at 9:48. By noon, Northstar's attorneys were demanding explanations. By 2, Whitmore's stock had fallen 6%. Claire did not reverse the decision. Ethan learned about it from Captain Hayes, not from her. That mattered too. The following afternoon, Sophie stood beside her science project inside a crowded convention hall near Boston Harbor. Ethan was helping her straighten a display card when Sophie suddenly looked toward the entrance. "Dad." Claire stood there alone. No assistant, no attorney, no executive team. In her hand was Sophie's paper airplane. Ethan's expression remained guarded as she approached. Claire handed it to Sophie. "You left this in the seat pocket." Sophie accepted it like something priceless. "You came all the way here for my airplane?" Claire smiled. "In your presentation, if I'm allowed to stay." Sophie looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Claire. "The acquisition," he asked. "Suspended. Because I told you to?" "No," Claire met his eyes. "Because I checked. You were right." Ethan said nothing. Claire continued. "I also ordered an independent review of every safety claim Northstar submitted. Whatever it costs us, we are not signing until every question has an answer. That will make your board unhappy. It already has. Your investors? Them too. And you still came here." Claire looked towards Sophie's project. "I spent years believing leadership meant never being the person in the room who was wrong. Yesterday, I was wrong several times before lunch." A faint smile touched Ethan's face. "That might be a company record." Claire laughed softly. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. Sophie returned carrying a folding chair she had dragged from the next display. She placed it beside Ethan's chair. "Miss Claire can sit here." Ethan looked at the empty seat, then at his daughter. "Sophomore, there's room." Claire did not move until Ethan pulled the chair out slightly with his foot. "You heard the boss," he said. Sophie beamed. Claire sat. 10 minutes later, Sophie began explaining airflow to 3 judges with complete confidence. Claire listened. Ethan watched Sophie, pride softening every line in his face. When the judges moved on, Claire whispered, "You were right about something else." "What?" "Some things matter more than the people around a boardroom table." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Do not tell me." He nodded towards Sophie. "Show her." Claire followed his gaze. Sophie was repairing one blue star on the wing of her model. "Ow?" Claire asked. Ethan's answer was quiet. "Stay." 1 year later, Ethan Cole still refused to own a suit that cost more than his monthly grocery bill. Claire tried once to convince him that a formal wardrobe might be useful for the new aviation safety laboratory. Ethan had asked whether fabric improved engineering judgment. Claire had never brought it up again. The Cole Aviation Safety Laboratory occupied a modest building outside Seattle, funded by several manufacturers but controlled by none of them. Ethan had accepted Claire's help only after making one condition clear. Whitmore Aerospace would receive no special access, no favorable reports, and no influence over his conclusions. Claire had smiled and signed the agreement. That was when Ethan began believing her change might last. North Star never completed the acquisition. The independent review uncovered enough missing test history to force a complete technical reassessment, and Claire spent months rebuilding Whitmore's safety approval process. It cost the company money. It cost her support from 2 directors. She never complained to Ethan about either. More importantly, she stopped treating people as titles. Engineers were invited into meetings that once belonged only to executives. Mechanics could halt a review if they found a safety concern. Junior employees could question senior leadership without risking their careers. Claire had learned that accountability was not admitting you had been wrong once. It was building something that made the same wrong harder to repeat. Ethan noticed. He simply did not reward her quickly for it. Trust returned in ordinary pieces. Coffee after Sophie's science club. Saturday mornings at the Aviation Museum. Phone calls that began with technical questions and ended 40 minutes later with neither of them remembering the original subject. Claire learned that Sophie hated peas, loved thunderstorms, and believed every airplane looked better with blue stars. Sophie learned that Claire could run a billion-dollar company, but could not fold a paper airplane that flew straight. Ethan learned something more difficult. Claire knew how to stay. She came when she said she would. She listened when Sophie spoke. She never tried to replace Rachel, and she never asked Ethan to erase the life that had come before her. By spring, there was a photograph on Ethan's refrigerator from Sophie's school fair. Sophie stood in the middle holding a blue ribbon. Ethan was on one side. Claire was on the other. Nobody had planned the picture. That was why Ethan kept looking at it. Their next flight to Boston came almost exactly a year after the first. Claire could have booked first class. Sophie objected. We need 3 seats together. So they sat in economy, Sophie at the window, Claire in the middle, Ethan beside the aisle. This feels familiar, Claire said. Ethan smiled. Your seat is approximately 17 inches wide. Nothing about this should feel comforting. Sophie leaned across Claire. Dad, normal people make jokes without measurements. The cabin door closed. Claire laughed and reached for Ethan's hand between the seats. He looked down at their joined fingers, then towards Sophie, watching airplanes taxi beyond the window. A year earlier, he would have pulled away. This time he did not. The speakers came alive. Captain Hayes welcomed the passengers aboard, gave the expected flight time, then paused. And I want to personally welcome an old friend traveling with us today, Ethan Cole. It is always good to have you aboard. Several passengers looked around. Ethan lowered his head with a quiet sigh. Sophie grinned. Claire turned toward him. The first time I heard that, I thought I needed to know who you were. Ethan looked at her. And now? Claire glanced at Sophie, then back at him. Now I know who you are when nobody important is watching. Ethan was silent for a moment. That is the only version that matters. Sophie reached across Claire and placed her small hand over theirs. Outside, the runway began moving. Claire looked at the 2 people beside her and understood something no acquisition had ever taught her. Ethan had never needed a powerful life. He had needed a meaningful one, and she had not entered it by purchasing a place, demanding one, or proving she deserved one in a boardroom. She had entered it slowly by staying. The aircraft lifted through the clouds, carrying 3 people east together, and for the first time in years, none of them was searching for a different life.